Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creator Studio weekly webinar. Today, we're going to be looking to configure ServiceNow CMDB queries with Creator Studio. Tune in the next couple weeks for some Salesforce use cases, as well as some SharePoint use cases. For today's agenda, we're going to look at doing some ServiceNow CMDB queries with Creator Studio, and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So to hop into it, what we want to be able to do today, let me go back here. What we want to be able to do today is query some information in a table within ServiceNow. So ServiceNow has a concept of a CMDB table, which is a parent table that hosts multiple subtables with a bunch of objects that can be related to them. So in today's example, I'm going to be looking at one specific table under the CMDB parent table, which is called CMDB CI outage. This table is meant to be used to record outages that are happening within your organization. So these can be outages for software applications, servers, really anything that can be represented within the CMDB table within ServiceNow. So if we're looking to be able to query outages that we've defined in the CMDB CI outage table, we would expect a conversation flow from our end user to our Moveworks bot to look something like this. So as an end user, I'm trying to connect to an internal system, say SAP, and I'm unable to connect to it. I can't log into it. I'm stuck in a loading loop, something to that effect. So I can ask my Moveworks bot, I'm having trouble connecting to SAP, or are we having some kind of outage? Here, based on the query that we're going to set up, we can query our CMDB CI outage table and see, do we have any ongoing outages that are related to this user's query, which in this case would be SAP. And if there is an outage related to the item that they're talking about on that table, we can then return the associated information of that outage as it's available within the ServiceNow API. So I'm going to hop into the demo. So I do want to provide a little bit of context here. So let's actually start within ServiceNow itself. So within ServiceNow, we have a concept of a CMDB CI outage table. So if I go to this table, I can see a list of all the outages that have been created within ServiceNow. Most of these have a defined end date, which means that we're no longer experiencing them. The outage or degradation has been resolved. But we do see that we have two open examples. One is for WebEx and one is for SAP Human Resources. So this means that I would expect if I have an end user who is querying for current outages, I would want to then retrieve these two rows from this table and present it to them based on the question that they're asking. So if they're asking for issues related to SAP, we would return the SAP row. If they're asking for issues related to WebEx, we would return the WebEx row. So before hopping directly into Creator Studio, let's look at what this looks like purely from an API perspective. So I'm going to open Postman. So here I have my Postman environment, and I have some API call. In this case, I'm querying my ServiceNow environment, which in this case is our dev environment, and I am querying for a table called CMDB CI outage, which is the table that we're viewing here in the UI. For our query, we want to be able to retrieve outages that are ongoing, so they're still open. We can tell that an outage is ongoing if the end date for the outage is empty. So in this case, we see all of these other outages that are resolved have a defined end date, whereas these ones that are ongoing do not. So when we run this query, we return these two rows. One is for the WebEx outage. The other one is for this SAP Human Resources outage. And we're returned some of the metadata information as well as the high-level information about this outage. So the message associated with it, the type, so this could be outage, degradation, or planned outage, the out number that's associated with it, and the short description. So there are two different kinds of use cases that we could implement as a query within Creator Studio here. One is generically returning all of the outages that exist within ServiceNow. So that would just be using this query. This is all of the outages as they exist within ServiceNow. Another way of doing it would be to query it using a like statement. So this allows us to leverage the machine learning and slot filling aspect of Creator Studio, where rather than just generically returning all of the outage information, we could only return information associated with the user's specific question. So again, if they're asking, I'm having an issue with SAP, is there an outage related to SAP? We could query for only SAP related outages. So optionality here, depending on how you would want it returned to the user. Do we want it to only return very specific information, or do we want it to return broadly information related to any outages that are currently ongoing? For today's webinar, what we're going to do is this version with the like statement. So now that I know, and I've confirmed in Postman that this is already working as expected, I'm going to go into Creator Studio. For our connector here, if you already have a ServiceNow instance in your environment that we're connected to, you can reuse the connector that already exists. It will likely be called Snow or ServiceNow. If you do not already have a ServiceNow connector associated with Moveworks, then we recommend creating one just with basic authentication, and that will just be the base URL of your instance as well as the username and password. So let me open my connectors. This is the one that we're going to be using for this. And we can see the base URL is everything up to servicenow.com. We're using basic authentication. I have my username, and then obviously my password is hidden. So this is the connector that we're going to be using. For a query label, I'm going to call this something descriptive that makes it very clear what the purpose of this query is. So we're going to say lookup outages by keyword. And the short description is going to be allow users to query for outages that exist in the CMDB CI outage ServiceNow table. Our connector is going to be our webinar connector, which again is just this connector right here. But in your environment will likely just be called Snow or ServiceNow. And then we're going to want to include the API endpoint path. So I'm going to post these side by side. So on the right, I have my Postman environment. On the left, I have Creator Studio. So what we're going to want to do here is define the API endpoint path after our base URL. So our base URL is what we define in the connector. So that's going to be everything up until this point. So after this point, to query for the call that I want, we're going to need everything up until CMDB CI outage. And I'm going to post that here. This is going to be the API endpoint path that we're going to be hitting. This is a GET request. And then we don't need any headers here. Our request body is able to be empty because it's just a GET request. We're not sending any additional information. And then for our query parameters, we can include these as they're defined here. So everything after the question mark is a query parameter. And the format actually is defined for us in Postman in a way where we can just mimic this back in Creator Studio. So we're doing a sysparm query that's going to be our key value. And then our value here is going to be end is empty. So again, confirming that this is still an ongoing issue that has not been resolved. This caret symbol represents an and statement. So the end field is empty, and in this case, we'll say the short description is like, and then a query statement. So this syntax is how we unpack a query from a user's question. So going back to our slide, when Gwen asks, I'm having trouble connecting SAP, we want to make sure that we're extracting SAP as a keyword here, and we're looking for related outages. So using this query syntax, we're able to do that, where we would expect if we're having an outage for a service, the service name is going to be included in the short description for that outage, and we're going to be able to then query by that. To test that this works as expected, I can then provide an example query value, which when we run our test will be plugged in here. Here we see that we get a result back, and our result is that SAP is currently down, SAP Human Resources outage, which matches exactly what we have here because we're hitting the same backend object within the ServiceNow table. So this shows me that it's working as expected, and we're properly slotting in our user's query in a way where if I, as an end user, am asking about a new outage that has been created, we'll properly be able to fill that in and query the table for the correct record and serve that back to them. So since this API response is one-to-one with what I want, I'm going to hit next. And then we're going to want to set our identifier and description. So this is going to be really based on what we feel makes the most sense. So for me, I feel like the identifier that makes the most sense would be the short description. And then in this case, we can just have the message as the description. SAP is currently down. There's other information that I'm going to want to be available to end users here. So I would want my end users to be able to understand, when did this outage begin? Maybe the problems that I'm having actually started before this outage began. Maybe they started right after. It'll provide me some level of clarity as to what's going on. We know that we're not going to have defined end dates, so we can leave that. But we may want to provide them an outage number, again, just letting them know this is an outage that we have recorded, and we do have information about it internally. None of this other information, well, except for type, is really relevant for an end user to know. So I've selected all the fields that could be relevant to them that they may want more information about. So this API labeling section means that all of the fields that I've selected are fields that Creator Studio may retrieve when a user queries for this information. We could select a follow-up action here. In this case, we're not going to. All we want to do is provide them information about the outages that we have that are ongoing. And here we have the triggering and lookup keyword section. So this is where I can provide example utterances for what types of questions I expect users to be asking to trigger this workflow. So what are the outages related to SAP? That one is perfect. Show me the details of the SAP outage, also relevant here. What is the outage number? Relevant. Can you provide me a short description of the SAP outage? What type of outage is SAP experiencing? And check the status of SAP in the outage records. All of these are good examples of what I would expect a user to ask to get this information back. These are all the ones that are automatically generated. We only need 3 examples to move on to the next step. And for now, these seem to pretty much cover my bases. If there are other questions I expect my users to ask, such as, I'm having issues with SAP, are we experiencing an outage? I can add that here as another example. just to reinforce the triggering of this workflow when users interact with Moveworks. So I'm going to hit next. I'm going to select a launch option. Because I'm testing this, I'm going to only launch it to myself for now. So I'm going to select launch to selected emails. I'm going to type in my own email address, which is jmcginley@moveworks.ai. And then I'm going to launch this use case. I'm going to give that a second to propagate. It could take a few minutes for me to actually be able to query this workflow in my Moveworks bot. While we're waiting for that, I did just want to call out the alternative implementation here. So we talked about two different ways of potentially being able to do this. One is with a user query, and one was just generically listing the outages that are available. So if I would just want to return a list of all of the current outages that we're experiencing, I could just remove this entire section here. And the only thing that we would be querying by is that there is no defined end date. So when we do this, instead of returning one specific outage that is related to the user's query, we would be hitting the API endpoint that we see here, which is just to list the ongoing outages. So rather than only seeing one result, we would see two. And users would see, okay, we're experiencing a degradation for WebEx, but we're also experiencing a full outage for SAP. So that's just a call out in terms of understanding from the outset whether it makes more sense to have something as a user-defined query where we want to retrieve information that's specific to what they're asking, or a broader query of being able to retrieve all the outages that are available. I also want to call out, for ServiceNow in particular, the overwhelming majority of any use cases that you're going to want to do within ServiceNow in regard to retrieving information is going to be formatted very, very similar to this. We're almost always going to be hitting the API for the tables, and then there will be some table associated with that. So as an example, the incident table for all ServiceNow incidents is something that is extended from this call, or SC rec item for service requests or RITMs. So if I wanted to build any use cases that are related to a table within ServiceNow, I could follow this very similarly, as well as the sysparm query. All of that syntax is the same across the entire ServiceNow API. So I could use logic similar to this for another ServiceNow use case that I may be interested in building. So we've given our use case some time to propagate. So I'm going to go to my Moveworks bot. And I'm going to say, I am having trouble with SAP. Are we experiencing any outages? I can see that we're properly triggering the workflow here. And we are returning the row that we were looking at within ServiceNow. So Moveworks comes back and says, yes, there is currently an outage affecting SAP, specifically SAP Human Resources. And that outage began on June 11th and is ongoing. So in addition to that, I'm going to be checking for the WebEx outage. I know from setting this up that we also have a degradation listed for WebEx. And if I query that, we can see that my Moveworks bot does return that we are experiencing degraded services or service degradation for WebEx. So because we are making this as a live API call, if we were to resolve these outages within ServiceNow by giving them a defined end date, they would no longer be returned by our query. as well as if we created any additional outages for any other services that were to go offline or experience a level of degradation, they would then be available. So now let's talk about how to learn more. We have a Creator Studio Developer Certification course on Moveworks Academy. This course has guided training modules that cover key concepts and learning objectives. It also has step-by-step videos detailing the key use cases of Creator Studio, and it has a certification available after passing a multiple choice exam to test your knowledge. We also have our documentation and developer community. So I highly recommend checking out the documentation for Creator Studio, especially if you haven't started. It can be kind of overwhelming if you just jump directly into the UI, like a lot of workflow tools are. So getting that high-level information, checking out the webinars to just get an idea of what does setting one of these up look like from start to finish will really build your confidence in interacting with it as a tool. And I also recommend checking out the developer community site. So we have a Moveworks community site, and it has a Creator Studio product forum. There you can ask questions to not only Moveworks employees, such as myself and the product owners, but also to other customers and developers who are setting up Creator Studio and have use cases that you may be interested in using and any interesting workarounds that they implemented in their environment. Finally, I want to open it up for Q&A. So I see from Daniel, wouldn't you want to include end in case people are checking quickly in the bot if the previous outage is over? So we could do that. In this case, I just wanted information related to ongoing outages to be available. But if I did want to query all outages generically, what I could have done is leave the section here for short description like query and remove this end is empty section. So what this would then enable from the perspective of talking to the bot would be, okay, I'm going to serve you all of the outages that we've had related to SAP. So this could be a poor user experience depending on how far back we go, right? So in this case, we don't have any defined time range. So it would just be any outage that we've had in the past that matches this query would then be available to be presented to the user. So if we were going to implement something like this, I'd probably recommend implementing a time range, like maybe within the last week or month or so. But this is something that we would be able to do. And then Jack, I created a query in our sandbox environment. Is there an automated or package to copy that to our production environment? Not currently. Unfortunately, right now, there is not a way to directly copy things from our sandbox environment to our production environment. We'll have to recreate those. But that is something that the product team is working on. You can get a better idea for the timelines for upcoming releases, again, by checking out Moveworks community, where you can talk directly to the product owners and ask them about their roadmap. And then I believe there was one other question. Somebody had their hand up. Diana asked, hi, what other popular use cases have you and your team helped build? We have an idea for task and REQ lookups for our tech agents, but not sure if this is possible through this. So in terms of making a use case available for a subset of users, that is possible through the setup launch section. So what we have here is ability to launch to users matching a role. And then this rule is built off of a query language that we use. I would recommend engaging with your customer success manager and just asking them to help you define your target group for who you would want this use case to be available for. In terms of querying tasks or REQs, that is something that we're able to natively set up through Moveworks. So not something that would require your team to build out a Creator Studio use case. If it's very specific to your agents, though, I would recommend, again, engaging your customer success manager and saying, I want to set up a Creator use case, a Creator Studio use case that's specific for my agents. Can you give me the syntax to launch it to only users who are IT agents? And then that will be based on some attribute in your environment. From there, you're also going to need to define what your API connection is. So if you just want to query the task table, as an example, you'd be able to do that here. But if you want to then do that where, say, assigned to is user.email address, maybe something that you want to do, right? But high level for this particular use case, I would recommend first just understanding, do we just want users in general to be able to query tasks and REQs? If so, engage your customer success manager, say, I want these two additional ticket types to be available within Moveworks. If it is more specific in the way that I've described, again, engage them in defining your launch group and then understanding the API endpoint paths that you actually want to hit to present information to those agents. Okay. And with that, we are at time. So we'll end it there. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Appreciate it as always, and tune in next week for some Salesforce lookups. Thank you very much.